The morning she became a duchess, Isolde Fairchild stood at the altar and felt the first cold thread of fear weave through her hope. The chapel at Coldharbour was ancient and beautiful, its stained glass windows spilling emerald and sapphire light onto the stone floor. She wore a gown of ivory silk that her mother had sewn with trembling hands, seed pearls scattered like frozen tears across the bodice. Her heart beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm. She had waited 10 years for this day, 10 years for the man standing beside her to turn, to look, to remember. But Gavriel Montfort, the Duke of Coldharbour, did not look at her. Not when she walked down the aisle. Not when the bishop bound their hands together with a silken cord. Not when he slipped the heavy gold ring onto her finger and sealed their union before God and 100 watching guests. His gray eyes, the color of winter clouds, remained fixed on the stained glass image of St. Christopher beyond her shoulder. She might have been a ghost. She might have been nothing at all. And yet, Isolde's heart still whispered, he will remember. Give him time. She had been 12 years old the day she first met him. It was the summer her father had hosted a hunting party, and the young heir to Coldharbour had come with his retinue, a dark-haired boy of 18 already carrying the weight of his future title. Isolde, shy and bookish, had hidden in the stables to escape the noise, curled in a pile of hay with a battered volume of Arthurian legends. She had not heard the approaching horse until the great beast nearly trampled her, and she had screamed, a high, terrified sound. The horse reared, and the rider, with astonishing calm, brought it under control and dismounted in one fluid motion. He had found her trembling, clutching her book to her chest like a shield. He had crouched before her, his eyes warm with amusement and unexpected kindness, and said, "You must be braver than that if you intend to read tales of dragons." Then he had extended his hand, pulled her gently to her feet and brushed straw from her hair. And when she had stared up at him, utterly smitten, he had laughed, a sound she would never forget, and declared, "When you are grown, I shall marry you, and you may read in my library all day long without anyone disturbing you." He had taken a wildflower from the nearby hedge and tucked it behind her ear. She had pressed that flower in her book, and she had kept his promise in her heart like a sacred flame. But the man who stood beside her now, his jaw rigid and his touch so terribly light, was not that boy. The years had hardened him into something distant and unreachable, and the worst of it, the deepest wound, was that he clearly did not remember the stable, the flower, or the promise he had made so carelessly on a golden afternoon a decade ago. The wedding banquet was a parade of well-wishers she did not know and compliments that felt like empty air. Gavriel sat beside her at the high table, his profile as sharp as a blade, his conversation brief and formal. He answered her tentative questions with single syllables. He did not touch her hand where it rested on the white linen. The guests saw. She felt their glances, pitying, curious, some even satisfied. Lady Marguerite Ashbury, a widow with raven hair and a gaze like cut glass, leaned toward her companion and murmured, just loudly enough for Isolde to hear, "A political arrangement, of course. The Fairchilds needed the alliance, and the Duke needed a quiet wife. One cannot expect warmth from such a match." The words hit Isolde like a slap, and she kept her smile fixed in place even as her chest hollowed out. When the last guest had departed and the great hall fell silent, a maid led Isolde to the Duchess's chambers, a cavernous room hung with tapestries of stags and hunters that made her feel impossibly small. She stood in the center of the room, still in her wedding gown, waiting. The door opened, and Gavriel entered. For one breathless moment she let herself hope. Then he stopped near the unlit hearth, his hands clasped behind his back, and spoke without meeting her eyes. "This is a marriage of political necessity, Isolde. I will provide you with every comfort, every protection. You will be respected as the Duchess of Coldharbour, but I cannot offer you what I do not possess. My heart has never been part of this arrangement. I trust you understand." She understood. The words were not cruel in tone. They were measured, polite, utterly devoid of emotion. And that was worse. She nodded because she could not speak past the shards of glass in her throat. He inclined his head the smallest bow and left. The door closed. The silence roared. Isolde sank onto the edge of the vast bed, and for the first time since her mother's death, she wept without making a sound, her tears soaking into the silk that was meant for a wedding night that would never come. The days that followed were a careful, desperate campaign. Isolde had not yet surrendered the hope she had carried for a decade. She rose early each morning and made certain the breakfast table held the honey cakes his housekeeper said he had loved as a boy. She learned the names of every servant, from the butler Mr. Harlan to the youngest scullery maid, and treated them with a gentleness that surprised them all. She asked the steward about the estate's history and walked the corridors, memorizing every portrait, every creaking floorboard, as if knowing the house might somehow unlock the man who lived inside it. She wore a gown of soft blue, the color Mrs. Harlan said the Duke's late mother had favored, and stood a little straighter when she entered the drawing room. But Gavriel looked at her with the same detached courtesy. He did not comment on the cakes. He did not notice the gown. At dinner, he read his correspondence and answered her few careful questions with distant politeness. She was a stranger in her own marriage, a ghost haunting a home that did not yet belong to her. One evening she gathered every scrap of courage and knocked on the door of his study, a place she had been told on her first day was not to be disturbed. He opened it and looked at her with an expression that was not anger, not annoyance, but simple, crushing indifference. Yes. She held out a small leather-bound volume of poems she had discovered in the library, thinking he might remember the girl who loved books. "I found this. I thought perhaps you might enjoy it." He took it without glancing at the cover. "Thank you, you may go." The dismissal was soft, but it carved a new hollow into her chest. She returned to her room, set the candle on the sill, and stared out at the darkening moor until her eyes burned dry. She did not approach his study again. Autumn arrived, and with it the village fair. It was a tradition the tenants cherished, and the Duke's presence was expected. Isolde stood beside Gavriel on the wooden platform as he addressed the crowd, his voice steady and commanding, his words full of duty. The people nodded respectfully, but their eyes kept drifting to the new Duchess. After the speech, a small girl with braids the color of straw approached Isolde and held up a crown woven from late-blooming heather and ivy. "For you, your grace," the child whispered. Isolde knelt in her fine gown, right there on the dusty planks, and let the girl place the crown on her head. She thanked her with such warmth that the crowd broke into spontaneous, delighted applause. Gavriel's gaze flickered toward her. For one instant, one fractured heartbeat, something moved behind the gray of his eyes. Surprise, interest. It vanished before she could name it, replaced by the familiar mask. He turned away and the moment died. But Isolde's hope, stubborn and bruised, flickered once more. Perhaps he was simply guarded. Perhaps patience would win what longing could not. She was wrong. The winter that followed was the loneliest of her life. Cold Harbor sat at the edge of the northern moors, and the wind howled through the corridors like a living thing. Gavriel retreated further into his work, spending long hours with his steward or riding out to inspect the far-flung holdings. Isolde kept the household running smoothly, sat through stilted meals, and smiled until her face ached. She tried to find purpose in small things, arranging fresh greenery at Christmas, reading to the maids' children in the kitchen, writing letters to her father that she filled with carefully crafted half-truths. "I am well. The Duke is kind." She could not bring herself to write the truth, that she was fading, invisible, a duchess in name only. She had stopped wearing the blue gown. She had stopped leaving the poetry book on his desk. She had stopped waiting for the sound of his footsteps in the hall. The breaking came quietly, without drama. One morning in late January she sat alone at the breakfast table, the honey cakes untouched on their silver tray. She looked at the empty chair opposite her, the chair he had rarely occupied, and felt something inside her shift. The hope that had sustained her for so long simply crumbled. It fell away like old plaster, and beneath it was a raw, clear realization. He does not want me. He never will. And I cannot spend my life begging for a love that does not exist. She set down her teacup with a hand that barely trembled. Then she called for her cloak and went out into the frost-covered garden alone. From that day, Isolde stopped trying to reach Gavriel Montfort. But she did not become bitter. She did not lash out or retreat into sullen silence. Instead, she turned her heart outward, toward the people of Coldharbour who had already begun to love her. She asked the steward, Mr. Carrick, to teach her about the estate's crop rotations and the struggles of the tenant farmers. She visited the cottages, carrying baskets of bread and simple medicines, sitting with the elderly and the ill, listening to their stories until the afternoon light faded. She started a small school in the village hall, teaching the children their letters and numbers. She laughed with them genuinely, and a sound the manor had rarely heard, began to echo through the lanes. The tenants spoke of her with glowing affection. Our Lady, they called her, the true heart of Coldharbour. And Gavriel, slowly, imperceptibly, began to notice her absence. At first it was only a vague discomfort. A meal passed without her presence. She was at the Davenport's cottage, helping with a new baby. He asked Mr. Harlan where she was, and the butler answered with a hint of surprise, as if the Duke should already know. "The Duchess is in the village, your Grace. She often is these days." Gavriel nodded and returned to his papers, but the quiet of the manor seemed deeper than before. He found himself listening, without quite realizing it, for the soft tread of her slippers, the murmur of her voice in the corridor. The flowers in the great hall, which she had once arranged with such care, were no longer there. The maids did it now, but they lacked her touch. The air felt colder. He dismissed the feeling as simple adjustment. He was wrong. The first true crack in his indifference came on an afternoon in early spring. He was walking back from the stables when he passed the orchard and heard laughter, Isolde's laughter, bright and unrestrained. He stopped. There, on the stone bench beneath the budding apple trees, she sat with a visitor. Sir Julian Thorne was a young baronet from a neighboring estate, a man with an open face, warm brown eyes, and an easy charm that Gavriel had always found faintly irritating. He had been a childhood friend of Isolde, she had once told him, though he had barely listened. Now Julian was leaning close to her, saying something that made her tip her head back and laugh again, her dark hair slipping from its pins, her cheeks flushed with joy. Gavriel's hand tightened on the riding crop he still carried. A hot, unfamiliar sensation coiled in his chest, something sharp and possessive and deeply unwelcome. He watched for a moment longer, watched the way Julian looked at his wife, the way Isolde's eyes sparkled with an ease she had never shown in his own presence. Then he turned and strode back into the house, his jaw set so hard it ached. That evening, Julian and his sister were invited to dine. Isolde sat across the table, and she spoke to Julian with a natural warmth that made Gavriel's food taste like ash. Lady Marguerite Ashbury, who had managed to secure an invitation as well, watched the interplay with the keen interest of a cat observing wounded birds. She leaned toward Isolde during the soup course, her smile gleaming. "How lovely to see such close friendship between you and Sir Julian. One might almost forget you are a married woman, your Grace. But of course, childhood bonds are the deepest, are they not?" The insinuation was unmistakable. Isolde's spoon paused midair and a faint color rose to her cheeks, but she answered with quiet composure. "Julian is like a brother to me, Lady Marguerite. I am fortunate in my friends." Julian's expression flickered, something Isolde did not see, but Gavriel did. A flash of something deeper than brotherly affection. The Duke's grip on his wineglass tightened until he thought it might shatter. After the guests had departed, Gavriel found himself standing in the corridor outside Isolde's door. He did not knock. He had no right. He heard a muffled sound from within, a sniffle, a soft, broken breath. She was crying, alone, again. And he was the architect of every single one of those tears. He stood there for a long time, his hand pressed flat against the ancient wood, an unfamiliar weight pressing on his ribs. Something was shifting inside him, some long-frozen part of his heart beginning, painfully, to thaw. But he did not know how to breach the wall he had built, and so he walked away, leaving her to her solitude. The rumors began the following week, seeded with the delicate malice Lady Marguerite specialized in. Whispered suggestions that the Duchess and Sir Julian had been seen alone in the gardens after dark, that their friendship was indiscreet, that the Duke's honor was being quietly mocked. The gossip slithered through the manor and reached Gavriel's ears through his valet, who repeated it with obvious reluctance. The Duke's reaction was immediate and visceral, not the cold anger of a man defending his name, but a hot, tangled knot of jealousy and fear. He knew in his rational mind that Isolde was not the sort of woman to be unfaithful, but the image of her laughing in the orchard, the light in her eyes when she looked at Julian, haunted him. And beneath that jealousy lay a deeper terror, that she might find in someone else the warmth he had so cruelly withheld. He confronted her in the drawing room that afternoon. Isolde was seated by the window, embroidering a cushion cover for the village school. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression made her set the needle down slowly. "I must speak with you," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "Your friendship with Sir Julian has become a topic of public conversation. I will not have the Montfort name dragged through scandal. I require an explanation." Isolde rose, her hands clasped in front of her. For a moment she simply looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he had never seen before. Not hope, not hurt, a profound, quiet resignation, as if she had been expecting this and was no longer surprised by it. "You believe the gossip, then," she said, her voice even, though a faint tremor ran beneath it. "You believe that I have dishonored you." "I did not say that." "You did not have to." She took a small step closer, and the afternoon light fell across her face, illuminating the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the weary set of her mouth. "I have done nothing wrong, Gavriel, nothing. But you have never trusted me with anything, not your heart, not your thoughts, not even the decency of a fair hearing. You married me out of duty, and you have treated me as a piece of furniture ever since. So I ask you, what does my reputation truly matter to you? You do not love me. You do not even see me, so why this sudden concern?" Her words landed like stones in still water, each one sending ripples through him. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. She waited, her chin lifted, her eyes brimming with a sadness so deep it stole his breath. When he remained silent, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps steady and unhurried, as if she had finally, irrevocably, stopped caring what he thought. Gavriel stood frozen, the realization crashing over him. He had pushed her so far that she no longer hoped, no longer fought, no longer needed anything from him at all. And the emptiness that opened inside him was the most terrifying thing he had ever known. In the days that followed, Isolde became, to all appearances, a serene and distant figure. She continued her work in the village, spent hours with the children, and dined in her chambers or with the tenants. She did not avoid Gavriel, but she no longer sought him out. When they passed in the corridor, she inclined her head politely and moved on. She was gracious, composed, and utterly unreachable, and he found himself watching her constantly. He saw the way she knelt in the mud to comfort a crying child. He saw her press a bag of coins into the hand of a farmer whose roof had collapsed. He saw her pause by the window at sunset, her profile soft and sad, and he ached to know what she was thinking. The distance he had created now felt like a chasm, and he had no idea how to bridge it. The discovery that broke him open came on a rain-lashed evening in late March. He had been searching the library for a document related to a border dispute when a drawer in the old escritoire stuck. He wrenched it free and found, hidden beneath a stack of yellowed ledgers, a small rosewood box. It was beautifully made, clearly precious, and he did not recognize it. Something made him lift the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, lay a pressed wildflower, brittle, brown, barely holding its shape. Beside it was a miniature painted on ivory, a portrait of a young man with dark hair, a half-smile, and eyes the color of winter clouds. Gavriel's breath stopped. It was him. Younger, softer, before the weight of the dukedom had carved its lines into his face. His hands trembled as he lifted the miniature. Beneath it was a slip of paper creased with age, the ink slightly blurred but still legible in a girlish hand. "Gavriel Montfort, who promised to marry me. I will keep this until he remembers." Isolde, age 12. The memory did not return in a gentle wave. It crashed into him like a tide of ice and fire. The stables. The frightened little girl buried in hay, clutching a book of legends. His own careless words, spoken to soothe a child. A promise he had tossed into the summer air and never thought of again. He had been 18, arrogant and thoughtless, and she had been a scrap of a thing with enormous blue eyes that had followed him with silent adoration. He had forgotten entirely. But she had carried that moment, that worthless, forgotten promise, for 10 long years. She had walked down the aisle expecting the boy who had smiled at her, and instead she had found a man who looked straight through her. She had endured months of coldness, loneliness, public humiliation, all while holding onto this tiny, fragile box of hope. Gavriel sank into the chair, the box clutched to his chest, and wept. He wept for the girl who had loved him so faithfully, for the woman he had wounded so deeply, for the years of tenderness he had thrown away. The sound of the rain against the windows was the only witness to his breaking. He did not go to her that night. He was too ashamed, too raw. He needed to understand the full scope of what he had been blind to. The next morning, he called the steward, Mr. Carrick, into his study. He asked questions he had never thought to ask before. What he learned stripped the last of his defenses away. Isolde had been using the income from her marriage settlement. Money he had assumed was being saved for gowns and trinkets to fund the building of a small infirmary in the village. She had paid for the physician's medicines, for the midwife's supplies, for the blankets that kept the elderly warm. She had taken nothing for herself. And then Carrick, hesitating, mentioned the letters. "The Duchess, your Grace, she has been writing to Lady Elise. Regularly, I believe. The footman posts them weekly." Gavriel stared at him. Elise was his younger sister, estranged from the family for years after a scandal that had deeply wounded their father. He had not spoken to her in nearly 5 years, too proud and too hurt to reach out. And Isolde, whom he had treated as a stranger, had been quietly, secretly, mending the broken threads of his own blood. He dismissed the steward and sat alone for a long time, his head in his hands. He had married an angel and he had given her nothing but silence. The fear of losing her became a tangible, clawing thing a week later, when Isolde collapsed. A fever had been spreading through the tenant cottages, a virulent sickness that had already claimed 2 of the youngest children. Despite the danger, Isolde had refused to stay away. She had spent 3 days nursing the sick, sponging brows and holding hands, until her own body gave out. They carried her back to the manor on a makeshift litter, her face ashen, her breath shallow and labored. The physician's expression was grave. The Duke, who had been riding the far boundaries when word reached him, galloped back through the rain and burst into her chamber like a man pursued by demons. For 4 days and 4 nights, Gavriel did not leave her side. He sat in the chair by her bed, holding her hand, watching the fever burn through her. He listened to her delirious murmurs, fragments of dreams, snatches of memory. She spoke of a wildflower, of a book in a stable, of a boy who had promised her forever. And then, in a voice so weary and so clear it cut him like a blade, she whispered, "I loved you. I loved you all this time, but it's too late now. I can't feel it anymore." Her fingers went limp in his, and Gavriel pressed his forehead to her knuckles, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had never been a praying man, but he prayed then, to any power that might listen, that she would not leave him before he could make things right. On the 5th morning the fever broke. Isolde opened her eyes to pale sunlight and the sight of the Duke slumped in the chair beside her, his dark hair disheveled, his jaw shadowed with days of stubble, his eyes red-rimmed and raw. He looked like a man who had been through a war. When he saw her awake, he straightened so abruptly he nearly knocked over the water glass. Isolde! Her name was a rasp, a prayer. She gazed at him, and he saw the moment the last faint veil of hope in her eyes guttered and went out. She had seen him there, she had heard his voice, but she did not believe it meant what she had once longed for. "You don't have to be here," she murmured, her voice a thread. "I release you from any duty. I'm not your burden." The words shattered him. He took her hand, so thin, so fragile, and cradled it in both of his. "You were never a burden," he said, his voice cracking. "You were my wife, and I destroyed every chance you gave me. I remembered Isolde. I remembered the stable, the promise. I found your box." Her eyes, which had been so dull and empty, widened. A tremor ran through her. "You remembered," she breathed. "Gavriel, I waited so long, I didn't think you ever would." "I remembered too late," he choked, tears sliding unheeded down his face. "I have been blind and cruel and so afraid. I lost my mother when I was a boy, and I swore I would never let anyone close enough to break me like that again. But I broke you instead, and I am so desperately sorry. Please, please don't leave me. Not now." She closed her eyes, and for a long, agonizing moment she was silent. Then a tear slipped from beneath her lashes and traced a path into her hair. "I wanted to hate you," she whispered. "I tried so hard to stop loving you, but I couldn't. It just went somewhere deep inside me, somewhere numb. I still love you, Gavriel, but I cannot survive being invisible again. If you are not certain if this is only guilt or pity, let me go. I will not hold you." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her fingers, his tears wetting her skin. "I am certain. I have been so afraid of losing you that I pushed you away, but I nearly lost you anyway. I love you, Isolde. I think I started loving you the moment you left honey cakes on my table, and I was too much of a coward to say thank you. I love you. Let me prove it, please." She looked at him then, really looked, and something fragile and brave flickered in the depths of her blue eyes. "Then prove it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not with words, with time." And he did. The healing was slow, like the first tentative shoots of spring after a brutal winter. Isolde did not leap into his arms. She was still too weak, too wary, too afraid of being shattered again. But she allowed him to sit with her during the long afternoons of her recovery. He read to her from the poetry book she had once offered him, his voice low and steady. He brought her cups of broth with his own hands and sat patiently while she gathered the strength to speak. He told her about his mother, about the icy loneliness of his childhood, about the walls he had built brick by brick. She listened, and in her silence there was a quiet, growing understanding. When she was well enough to walk, he escorted her through the gardens, their pace slow and careful. He pointed out the places he had loved as a boy, and she told him about the tenants, the school, the infirmary. He did not interrupt. He learned. He saw the world through her eyes, and it humbled him. One afternoon, under the apple tree where he had once watched her laugh with Julian, he stopped and faced her. "I was jealous," he admitted, his voice rough. "Of Julian, of the way you looked at him. I had no right to be, but it tore me apart." Isolde looked at him with a soft, sad smile. "Julian was my friend when I had no one," she said, "but he was never you, Gavriel. No one has ever been you." The simple honesty of the words undid him. He arranged for his sister Elise to visit. The reunion in the great hall was awkward and tearful and beautiful, a tapestry of old hurts and new beginnings. Isolde stood quietly to the side, her hands clasped, and when Elise turned to her and said, "You wrote to me when my own brother would not. You gave me back a family." Isolde's composure broke at last, and the two women embraced. Gavriel watched, his heart so full it ached. On the first anniversary of their wedding, he took her back to the chapel. It was not a public spectacle this time, only a handful of close friends, the tenants who adored her, and a bishop who understood the weight of second chances. Gavriel had commissioned a new locket, and inside it he had placed the pressed wildflower from her rosewood box, preserved now behind glass, and a miniature of the two of them together, painted from memory. He fastened it around her neck with hands that shook only slightly. Then he took her hands and looked into her eyes, those eyes that had once held so much hope and then so much sorrow, and now held a fragile, luminous peace. "Isolde," he said, his voice ringing in the quiet chapel, "I married you out of duty. But I am making this vow now out of love. I see you. I will never stop seeing you. I will spend every day of my life earning the chance you have given me." She wept openly and freely, and her smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I have always seen you, Gavriel," she whispered back. "Even when you were lost, I saw the boy who promised, and I will keep seeing him, keep seeing you, forever." They walked out of the chapel into a golden afternoon, the village bells pealing joyfully, the tenants showering them with heather and blessings. And as they stood together on the steps of Cold Harbor, her hand securely in his, both of them understood that the truest love was not the one that arrived easily or remembered everything. It was the love that had been forgotten, broken, and then, against all odds, chosen again, with eyes wide open and hearts finally unshielded. The future stretched before them, soft and imperfect and luminous, and they walked into it side by side, no longer invisible to each other, no longer alone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. Your support means a lot to us. Thank you for watching and see you in the next amazing story.